Once you have a theory, you want to test it. And to test it, you look for the exceptions to the rule. Paradigms are theories that now are sort of beyond question. But I chose to question the paradigm surrounding the 350-year-old machine model of biomechanics. On this talk, we will focus mostly on muscle mechanics, but there's more to be said about bone, cartilage, and the various other fascias. Let's start with agonists and antagonists. Quadriceps and hamstrings are antagonistic to each other, right? Now put one hand on your anterior thigh and your other hand on your posterior thigh and stand up. It should be obvious to everyone that the hamstrings and quadriceps contract simultaneously. Muscles co-contract and work in parallel. This is a well-known phenomena known as Lombard's paradox. This was described in 1903, and it really isn't difficult to show that this is the norm rather than the unusual. When working synergistically, muscles work as closed kinematic chains. These are four or more links connected by hinges that work in conjunction with each other as the familiar pantograph. And a clear example of this is the cruciate ligaments of the knee. Note the connecting links remain isometric. They do not shorten or lengthen. Just look around a bit and those closed kinematic chains are ubiquitous. Here is a video from the antibody of modeling system, and you can see that the so-called agonist and antagonist muscles co-contract. I will freeze frame it for you. Now that you know what to look for, various combinations and permutations of muscles become quite obvious. Here are a few possibilities. Conventional wisdom has it that muscles can move an external force. Let me show you what I mean. This is Gabby Brown en point. Conventional wisdom would have it that she rises up on her toes using the gastrocnemius muscle as part of a second-class lever system. But wait! Lifting the body by using your gastrocs would be like pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. It can't be done. If we are using a lever model, what you really have is a third-class lever with the metatarsal heads as your fulcrums and the necessary external force coming through the toe flexors. Clearly impossible. They would be torn apart. Muscles are internal forces and would work like chemical bonds, keeping the structure intact. External forces could affect them, but they could not create an external force, only interact with them. Even if the muscles, ligaments, and bone acted as springs, they would still need an external force to load them. So, internal forces, muscles, cannot start, stop, or change direction of an organism all by itself. It must interact with an external force to do so. In this illustration, the person moving the box borrows its force from its interaction with the ground reaction force. And that means the body is acting as a spring, an intermediary between two external forces. I know you are all familiar with Newton's first law: for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. How does that play out in our understanding of biomechanics? For the most part, it is apparently ignored. We somehow seem to think that muscles can vector forces at right angles to their line of pull. This is an excerpt from Professor Scott Turner's talk on walking. Forces are not equal and opposite, and he is using an internal force to move an external force. And ignoring Newton's laws seems to be the standard rather than the unusual. For example, shake your wrist. It is obviously just a bag of bones with no inherent stability. Hold a weight in your outstretched hand. To keep the sloppy wrist joint from falling over, you need an equal and opposite force pushing up. But all the wrist flexors are at right angles to the gravitational pull on the ball and the weight of the hand, and there's zero chance of the muscles stiffening the wrist enough so it doesn't flap over. And that brings us to the paradigm that muscles function by shortening. In the lab they certainly do, and the cellular explanation for this is the sliding filament theory. Note that is a theory, not a fact, and is based on the assumption that muscles shorten. As far as I can tell, there has been no experimental proof of that theory. It is questioned by some, and laboratory experiments may not accurately reflect what is going on in a real-life situation. So let's test this live and in person. Grab something in your hand that's hard, like a glass of water, and squeeze. You just performed an isometric contraction of your muscles. There was no shortening. What you did note was a bulking up and stiffening of the muscles. Note that the so-called flexors and extensors were working in parallel. And the muscles underwent a phase change, going from soft and mushy to hard and springy. This is a phenomenon known as auxetic, and we'll leave that for another discussion. We have raised some questions that clearly challenge the usual lever model. Is there a way out of this dilemma? There is, by changing paradigms. A wise biomechanics person once told me that you can't pull a rug out from people without giving them a floor to stand on. So let's step back a bit and compare models. A useful model for standard biomechanics is the wagon wheel. It started out as a solid disc some 5,000 years ago. About 4,000 years ago, some clever person figured out that if you made the rim and spokes stiff enough, you could hollow it out a bit and make it a bit lighter. The Chinese, Egyptian, and Roman chariots all had a rigid spoke wheel, making them much lighter than the solid disc wheel. But it remained a continuous compression structure with the compressive load vaulting from one spoke to the other. It seems to be a perfect metaphor for walking. Less than 200 years ago, George Cayley reinvents the wheel, the first significant design change in 3,000 years, and using a radically different and unique concept. Instead of compression spokes, where the weight of the load is borne by each spoke in turn, Cayley's wheel is a tension-spoked wheel, where the combined continuous tension of the spokes share the load. The compressed rim is separated from the compressed wheel hub by the tension spokes, and Cayley had invented a continuous tension, discontinuous compression device that I consider to be the first tensegrity structure designed by humans. The bicycle wheel is much lighter and uses considerably less material than a compression strut wheel. About 100 years later, Kenneth Nelson volumized the somewhat squashed continuous tension, discontinuous compression structure of the bicycle wheel, bringing it to its full three-dimensional depth. Buckminster Fuller then appropriated the structure and concept into his thinking, renamed it tensegrity, and delved into its complexities most thoroughly in his book Synergetics, which is no longer in print but available online. In 1975, I had the thought that Mother Nature started using tensegrity some 4 billion years before Cayley even thought of it. And that was the start of the science of biotensegrity. And with the new paradigm comes new ways of thinking of the body's mechanics. Biotensegrity is a complex science. We won't go into the details here, but just a comparison chart comparing mechanical characteristics of the 350-year-old lever system model of the body, what is known about biological systems, and Mother Nature's 4-billion-year-old tensegrity system. There is an obvious mismatch between Borelli's lever system and biosystems, and a perfect match between biosystems and tensegrity systems. What looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and walks like a duck is a duck. So we have pulled the rug out from what has been the conventional lever system and offered a solid floor upon which to stand.